Alright, you guys, this episode of Paradigm Profiles is called The NF's Resurgence, the Indictments, the Blancos, and the Aftermath. The 1990s were some of the most violent and tumultuous years in the existence of Nuestra Familia's history. Since its inception in the early to mid 1960s, this organization established itself within the California prison system and emerged as a formidable adversary to some of the other prison gangs that were already established, namely other groups such as the Mexican Mafia and the Aryan Brotherhood. During the inception of the Nuestra Familia, nobody took this group serious. At the time, CDC wrote them off as just another fly-by-night group of inmates that banded together within the Hispanic collective, and that it was motivated by one purpose and one purpose alone: survival. CDC became aware of the fact that several skirmishes had been erupting within the Hispanic collective, but again, this was written off as just another one of the many sporadic incidents that was taking place within an ethnic group that was geographically and demographically divided. You guys have to understand that prison politics were entirely different back in these years. The M and the AB had fierce reputations, and they had a free-for-all on anyone and everyone who either wasn't affiliated or associated with their groups. Even with those that were of the same ethnic group, non-affiliated whites and non-affiliated Hispanics became open targets. Over time, and over the course of several defining incidents, the Mexican Mafia would later forge an alliance with the Aryan Brotherhood. This was self-serving for both groups, and it benefited their political agendas. The Nuestra Familia would likewise forge an alliance with the Black Guerrilla family, paving the way for a bloodbath that would extend to all four fronts of the entire California prison population. Initially, in those days, the political schemes for the MA and the AB was about controlling the main lines and the illicit crime brackets, maintaining power and monetary gain. Drugs, gambling, and prostitution were the main sources of revenue for these groups. The MA and the AB established a symbiotic business arrangement insofar as controlling the main lines and sharing in the financial gains from these crime brackets. The Nuestra Familia initially didn't have that same vision. It was focused more on just surviving and curtailing the abusement that were being inflicted by its adversaries. It was only later, when they became a force to be reckoned with, when they recognized the potential in controlling the illicit crime brackets that the MA and AB had been pursuing. Years later in the 70s, the Nuestra Familia decided to take its vision to the streets so that it could become a financially self-supporting and self-sustaining organization. The Mexican Mafia, the Black Guerrilla family, and the Aryan Brotherhood had already began working on the streets, and like the Italian Mafia, these criminal organizations learned that they held the potential to generate hundreds of thousands of dollars. Mostly all the original leaders of the Nuestra Familia were from Southern California. The organization would be organized under a paramilitary structure, but in the beginning stages, there was a counseling system established under what was known as La Tabla, aka La Mesa, or the table in Spanish. Some of the first La Mesa members chosen were Lips, aka Little John from San Gabriel Valley's Big Bassett gang, Chalo Hernandez from Bakersfield, MA leader Shai Cadena's cousin, Weddle from West LA's Clanton gang, Freddie Fernie Gonzalez from Temple Street in San Diego, Diara from Pacuema in the San Fernando Valley, Sammy from New Mexico, and Black Jets from Chiques in Oxnard. One of the first organized NF street regiments that law enforcement would discover was in Fresno, California in 1976. At that time, Fresno was considered to be an NF power base and stronghold for the NF. The regiment began taxing pimps, prostitutes, and drug dealers. The proceeds were then put into a central bank fund that was originally used to take care of the less fortunate incarcerated members. This was how it used to be when the cause was still the cause. But years later, when the corruption set in, this was relegated to a big smokescreen. The NF hit the streets of Northern California hard, and without any real blueprint or street training, it didn't take long for the gang to begin suffering its first series of indictments. In fact, it didn't even take a full year. In 1977, NF Captain John Mousy Hernandez and squad leader Rabo Prado Rocha became the first two members to defect and testify against the group. High-ranking Nuestra Supreme Commander Art Big Rock Beltran and Nuestra Familia's First Lieutenant Joe Death Row Joe Gonzalez would soon follow. Beltran exposed familia regiments previously unknown to law enforcement in San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose, and Sacramento. In 1981, Nuestra Supreme Commander Robert Babo Sosa from Santa Barbara was indicted on racketeering charges, which also included 8 murders. On January 19, 1982, the indictments were consolidated and 25 members were formally named in the racketeering indictment. The indicted members were Robert Babo Sosa, Joe Death Row Joe Gonzalez, Art Big Rock Beltran, Arturo Serrato, Kenneth Cassie, Raymond Castaneda, Jose Cabos, Raymond Contreras, James Cozad, Anselmo Dominguez, Alfredo Azaldi, Robert Flores, Ronaldo Garcia Jr., David Hernandez, Philip Lopez, Guadalupe Ramirez, Ruben Ceja, Daniel Serrano, William R. Soto, Sammy Hanegas, Ruben Garnica, Manuel Montelango, Eddie Vindiola, Cesar Gutierrez, and Alfredo Guerrero. The organization recovered and rebounded soon after it was hit with these indictments, and it would continue building over the next 10 years. By the early 90s, the NF was flourishing and thriving on the streets of Northern California. Some of the more established regiments were in San Francisco, Stockton, Sacramento, Oakland, Fresno, and San Jose. In 1984, the Nuestra Raza was created by Cornelio Corny Tristan from Woodland, Hector Copas Gallegos from Salinas, and Robert Brown Bob Viramontes from Morgan Hill. By the early 90s, this sub-gang was also thriving with thousands of members, and the vast majority of them were working together with the NF street regiments. In the early 1990s, it was by mere coincidence that several high-ranking NF members were all paroling to the streets of San Jose at around the same time. One by one, they paroled, and they all shared the same objective: to revitalize the San Jose Street Regiment and to begin generating revenue for the organization. But along with breaking new NF ground and setting their plan in motion came one of the ominous tasks that the NF seemed to languish in: killing. One of the first orders of business was to begin killing any NF hermits that were out there on the streets of San Jose, and then to begin killing anyone who stood in the way of the building process. This included any of the high-level Norteño street dealers who weren't quite sold on the idea of working with or contributing to this prison gang that had dropped their flag right in the middle of the hood. Although the NF's following and influence in San Jose was probably at its peak in the early 90s, there were still those Norteños out there who believed in their own independence and their own individual right to pursue self-enterprise. The NF and the NR were pushing a hard line back in those years, and there were some things that they just weren't willing to compromise on. Failing to contribute or failing to conform to the expectations and requirements that the NF mandated when it came to its building process was one of them. So over the course of the next few months, these indifferences would continue to play out and clash with several different characters in San Jose and would soon be the topic of headline news. The San Jose spate of killings was allegedly set in motion on April 19, 1990, when Louis Dump Truck Chavez was paroled from Pelican Bay State Prison, carrying a hit list allegedly drawn up behind bars by the Mesa, the Nuestra Familia's ruling council. But the first thing Dump Truck did with the hit list was to quietly slip it to his parole officer, E.J. Allen. Dump Truck had obviously reached a crescendo in his so-called criminal career, to where he was tired and no longer had the desire to be around the violence or the day-to-day going-ons of the Nuestra Familia. As is often the case with a lot of older members who had spent years in prison and who had experienced a lot of violence, Dump Truck just didn't want to be part of that life anymore. He wanted to go on in life and enjoy being a father, a grandfather, and some of the normalities that a normal lifestyle had to offer. However, unfortunately for Dump Truck, the NF's blood in, blood out philosophy was something that he was going to have to consider, and this would alter the course of his life one way or the other. Dump Truck was recruited into the NF in 1989 by Joseph Pinky Hernandez and Vincent Chente Arroyo. At the time Dump Truck gave his parole officer the copy of the hit list, he wasn't in bad standings and there wasn't any reason for him to cooperate besides his own motivations. However, later on when the murder started in San Jose, he was put on freeze and was told his status would be restored once he brought back a body, i.e. once he committed a murder. And this wasn't for committing any murder. It had to be a murder specifically committed for the benefit and at the direction of the NF. But unbeknownst to Dump Truck, the regiment was actually plotting to kill him, and the plan was already in motion. The bloodletting wouldn't start for several months. A couple months later, Bobby Silencio Lopez, Ronald Lucky Shelton, Eddie Pajaro Vargas, James Huevo Trijique, Jerry Cripple Jerry Salazar, Sheldon Skip Villanueva, and Herminio Spanquillo Serna would all parole to the streets within months of each other. Other NF and NR members were already out there and in position for what was about to happen. When the bullet-riddled bodies started turning up on the streets and playing fields of San Jose, it was obvious that a gang war had broken out. But this was a rivalry with a twist. This was not a war between competing gangs. Instead, the 10 victims were executed by their own underworld friends and family in a misguided campaign to revitalize the Nuestra Familia gang in San Jose. The NF had been quiet and dormant for years, but this was by design. Over a 10 to 15 year time span, the leaders who were housed in the SHU programs had been regrouping, reorganizing, and regenerating in preparation to take San Jose back over. In those years, San Jose, like Monterey, San Joaquin, Sacramento, and Kern counties, was considered NF territory and prime real estate for generating money. On a practical level, the 3-year murder spree that began in 1990 would later result in one of the costliest series of trials in Santa Clara County history. County officials would end up spending $10 million in the first couple of years after the trials began. Those numbers would increase expeditiously and would continue to mount until the trials were adjudicated. But these trials would also offer something else that was priceless. It would offer an inside look at a much vaunted family at the heart of Nuestra Familia that was a profoundly dysfunctional one, a soap opera tangle of duplicity, adultery, drugs, and betrayal. Behind the rhetoric of racial pride lurks the constant threat of sudden death, and not from a stranger's hand. All this high noon playing around just ended up littering the streets with bodies. The NF killed their own, something that has continued to be a normal practice since its inception. It was an idiotic way of doing business, or crime. In the 1980s, as the NF grew, it set up the farm league called the Nuestra Raza. The NF created the NR under the same ideology and philosophy. They represent the same flag, the same colors, the number 14, and the symbol of the Northern Star. Members swear fealty to the gang and vow to uphold the 14 bonds, the format, and the NF's dictates, all of which mandate secrecy, obedience, and respect within the movement. But given the amount of double dealing on the part of almost everyone involved, it's a mystery why Familianos have trusted each other at all. It's been a game of cutthroat since the late 80s to early 90s. The bloodbath began soon after Silencio and Lucky were paroled and meshed their murderous energies in an attempt to assert control. Lucky would later be appointed to become the regimental commander for the San Jose Regiment, and Silencio was appointed to be his newly minted second in command. And then the bloodletting started. Body after bullet-ridden body began to turn up on the streets of San Jose. The regiment embarked on a serious order of house cleaning, and the targets were everywhere. Even though authorities had a jump start on this investigation after Dump Truck handed over the hit list to some of the people who were being targeted, they still didn't know who all the players were and had nobody working with them that was still operating within the gang. The one thing that stood true at that time is that there wasn't a lot of people who were willing to work with the cops and who were willing to outright betray the NF. During those years, the NF still commanded a level of fear that continued to resonate all over the streets of Northern California. The consequences were imminent, and everybody knew this. Bodies were being dropped everywhere. That's one of the main reasons why there's so many defectors who are willing to cooperate, and then who are still somewhat comfortable continuing to reside in the heart of Northern California today. So the hit list that Dump Truck handed over was put together by Joseph Pinky Hernandez and Pablo Pantera Peña. This was during a time when Dump Truck was housed in the SHU at Tehachapi State Prison. Among some of the people that were on the hit list were Tony Little Weasel Herrera and James Jocko Esparza, both for being gang dropouts. Carlos Mejia secured his spot on the list for having an NF member stabbed and killed. He was able to do this during a time when he was delegated a position of authority. He then used that position to have this hit carried out. Definitely a ballsy move. He obviously either thought he could get away with this, or he was somehow under the impression that he had the backing of the organization behind him. Coincidentally, Carlos Mejia was the first victim on the list to be hit, but he survived. On July 4th, 1990, Cripple Jerry Salazar organized a barbecue in Kelly Park. NF members Lorenzo Lencho Guzman and Victor Sleeper Escabel were both in attendance when Carlos showed up uninvited. Knowing he was on the hit list, Cripple Jerry called Dump Truck and informed him that Carlos was there at the park. Dump Truck then told Cripple Jerry to provide a knife to Sleepers and Lencho and to have them proceed with the murder. After being given the orders, Sleeper and Lencho lured Carlos to an area by a 7-Eleven mini mart where Sleeper stabbed him. Sleepers ended up butchering him in an area behind the 7-Eleven until Carlos was incapacitated and was no longer moving. After the stabbing, they returned back to Kelly Park about 30 minutes later. Believing that Carlos was dead, they reported this back to Cripple Jerry, but later found out he survived. At an NF meeting on November 17, 1990, attended by Lucky, Silencio, and Huevo, the NF decided to kill Tony Little Weasel Herrera, a major drug dealer and a baller who was moving a lot of weight in San Jose. Little Weasel was already on the hit list, but John Blanco, a prominent San Jose drug dealer who was present at the meeting, said that Little Weasel had told police about his activities. The Blancos were a legendary family that was well respected and fully embraced by the NF. Quite a few reputable, well-placed NF members stamped this family and gave them their blessings when it came to working with them. The fact that John Blanco was allowed to sit in on an NF meeting where murders were discussed gives you a general idea of how respected they really were, especially at a time when security was of the highest priority and where it would have been considered a major breach in security to allow outsiders to sit in on a meeting like this. Nobody seemed to have spoke up or raised any underlying concerns about it. Lucky, who had earlier opposed the killing of Little Weasel because Little Weasel was assisting the NF with drugs and other resources, volunteered to carry out the murder. His reasoning for explaining his sudden change of heart was that the RSD, the Regimental Security Department, had to set an example. But this was self-serving. Lucky had ulterior motives for wanting to personally knock Little Weasel down. He just used this as an opportunity to make a quick grab at morality. On November 19, 1990, 2 days before Little Weasel's murder could be carried out, Lucky, Sheldon Skip Villanueva, another well-known NF member who was to participate in the murder, was arrested. Skip called Lucky from the county jail and indicated that he strongly believed that Little Weasel told the police about him. Not to get off track, but this just goes to show you guys that even at a time as far back as then, a solid norteño's life was taken based on speculation alone. Little Weasel wasn't an NF member, but he was a norteño, and he did deserve to be given the benefit of the doubt. Skip made this call based on a hunch, nothing concrete, no paperwork, nothing else indicative that Little Weasel had given him up, just mere speculation alone. And then later on, it would be determined that he didn't in fact tell on Skip, but by then, it was too late. On November 20th, 1990, Lucky met with Silencio to plan Little Weasel's murder. Silencio was supposed to obtain a gun used for the murder, and then he was supposed to get a Chevy Chevette from a close friend named Betsy Spencer. Betsy was the sister of Angel Spencer, who at that time was a well-known, fully functioning NR member. Lucky, Huevo, and Silencio then discussed the need to kill Little Weasel. Huevo suggested that they dump Little Weasel's body in a park. Later that day, Lucky, Silencio, and Huevo met Little Weasel on the east side of San Jose and asked him to get inside Spencer's Chevette. They pulled up and told Little Weasel to get in the back with Huevo. Luckily for Little Weasel, it was a 4-door. Otherwise, he would have been trapped in the back seat and only would have been able to get out if he somehow got past Silencio, who would have had to move up his seat. But in all actuality, this only prolonged the inevitable. When Little Weasel was inside the car, Huevo displayed a .38 caliber revolver. Huevo got out of the car, pointed the gun at Little Weasel, and pulled the trigger twice. The gun did not fire. I don't know what condition this gun was in, but for some reason, I picture it having duct tape wrapped around the handle and a cylinder that was rigged into place. Not even what you would consider to be a Saturday night special, more like a Friday night loser. Huevo probably pulled it out of a toolbox in his garage or something. At any rate, Little Weasel got out and hit the burners. He broke into a full run and tried to get away. But Silencio tackled him and gave Lucky the brief few seconds he needed to pump 6 bullets in the Little Weasel's head right in the middle of Wooster Avenue. Huevo then fired his contraption again, and after a few more misfires, the gun finally went off. In December of 1990, while attending Little Weasel's funeral, Robert Jasso, a bouncer at JP's bar in San Jose, a prominent bar that was a well-known NF hangout and was also called Just Parolees, was overheard saying, "Fuck Lucky. I know Lucky had something to do with Little Weasel's murder." When Lucky heard about this, he obviously took this as a show of disrespect to not only himself, but to the NF as well. Lucky then directed Silencio, his second in command, to have Jasso killed, adding that he wanted all NF members to know that Jasso was to be killed, meaning he basically put a blanket green light on him and that he was open game for whoever saw him first. Lucky said, "If we let Jasso's disrespect to the NF pass, it would cause diminution of the NF's power and people would just not be willing to cooperate with drug transactions on a respectful level." This was the fear that I mentioned earlier. People on the streets feared the NF, and Lucky was trying to prevent seeing any diminution or waning of that fear to occur. Jossel's murder was further discussed at two other NF meetings, in December of 1990 and April of 1991. Silencio, Robert Rios, aka Conejo, another up-and-coming NF member, and Jason Vasquez, a solid NR member who was assigned to the San Jose Regiment, looked for Jossel in late winter or early spring to kill him. However, when they found Jossel, they couldn't take him out at that time because there were police in the area. I believe they spotted him somewhere on the west side, but there was a presence of police in the area, and to follow through with the murder would have ultimately been committing a kamikaze. Larry Valles was the next victim. Larry was a high-level PCP dealer who was refusing to make any contributions to the regiment. At one NF meeting, the members discussed the need for Larry to kick down. Larry continued to refuse, so it was decided that Larry needed to be jacked up. Lucky subsequently arranged a meeting with Larry. The purpose of this meeting was obviously to set him up and allure him to his death. Although Larry had several confrontations about the need for him to start contributing, it hadn't escalated to the point to where Larry perceived he had to be concerned about any threats. So when he was summoned to this meeting, he did so without any concerns or premonitions that he was going to be hit. Lucky arrived first. After Larry arrived, Silencio also arrived. Out of Larry's presence, Lucky and Silencio discussed the extortion they were going to make. That was the whole purpose of the meeting, to tell Larry that the jig was up, that they were no longer requesting that he start kicking in a percentage to the regiment, but that they were now mandating it. When they finally did confront him and laid out their terms, Larry stood his ground and refused to conform with any of their propositions. Who knows how they spun it, but Larry was one of those guys that just didn't agree with kicking in on any level. Not when it was being mandated anyway. It would have been different if he would have decided to make these contributions entirely on his own, but that's not how this was playing out. Larry seen this for what it was. He was being taxed. There's those that just don't agree with prison politics being mandated or enforced in their neighborhood. Tribal loyalty is strong and often supersedes any justification for bringing these politics back to the hood. Criminal organizations like the NF and movements like the NR are looked at as being interlopers, guys who have been politically brainwashed behind the walls and then who put those politics before the loyalty of their neighborhood. That's what's called tribal loyalty, and this is something that was strong even back in those years. The love and respect a lot of these guys have for their neighborhoods, where they came from, is unbreakable and is often stronger than any beliefs they might have adopted from behind the walls. Larry stood his ground and told Lucky and Silencio that he did not pay rent to anyone. Lucky took Larry's refusal and defiance as the highest level of disrespect, and as a result, he shot Larry right between the eyes. But Lucky had ulterior motives for wanting to knock Larry down as well. Lucky was in love with a female who Larry had started dating. I believe her name was Nadine. Lucky was infatuated with her and didn't like the fact that Larry started dating her. So when this issue came up with Larry, Lucky was more than willing to kill him. Following the murder of Larry, Silencio authorized the murder of Alfonso Wedo Urango because Wedo disrespected the NF by not returning 2 guns that belonged to the regiment. Initially, Wedo was asked to hold the guns for safekeeping, and that's how he came into possession of them. Later, when they attempted to get the guns back from Wedo, he said that he would trade the guns for a gram of PCP. I knew Wedo, and he wasn't no stupid dude. But in order for him to openly defy the NF at that time and offer to give them back guns that belonged to them for a gram of PCP was a death sentence. Wedo was basically trying to extort the NF. Obviously, the PCP he was smoking had fried one too many of his good brain cells. In fact, we even hit Wedo in the AC for this same reason, so this was an ongoing issue he had been dealing with. As expected, Wedo's offer was insulting and resulted in an automatic green light. In late June or early July of 1991, NF members Cripple Jerry, Carlos Gusano Mendoza, and Roland Saldivar went to Wedo's apartment to kill him. When they arrived, Cripple Jerry told Saldivar and Gusano to go to the apartment door, knock on it, and shoot Wedo when he opened up the door. When Saldivar and Gusano knocked on the door, Wedo's girlfriend, who was 8 months pregnant, answered the door. Saldivar and Gusano did not have the guts to kill Wedo under the circumstances. No further attempts on Wedo's life were made. Fate was obviously on his side that day. Eli Rosas was the next unfortunate victim. Eli was a member of the NR who was accused of disrespecting the NF. On December 31st, 1983, 2 masked men broke into the home of Petra Gonzalez, who was the mother of Eli's girlfriend. Eli apparently went to Gonzalez's defense. After the Gonzalez robbery, and while NR member Raul Roy Riveles was still in prison, he told Dump Truck that he had robbed Eli's home taking drugs. Roy further told Dump Truck that he believed that Eli had snitched on him. Dump Truck stated that even though Eli was the victim, Eli should not have said anything to the cops because Roy was a member of the NR at the time of the robbery. In all actuality, that really had no bearing on whether it was okay for Eli to speak on this incident either way. I don't know what Dump Truck's point was, but it didn't matter what Roy's status was. Bottom line is, it's against the street code to make statements under any conditions. In late June of 1991, Edward Pajaro Vargas told Cripple Jerry that there was a green light on Eli because Eli had snitched on Roy. However, Pajaro wanted to get some paperwork confirming this first, because if he was wrong and Eli was killed, he would be killed. He was basically covering his ass. Pajaro told Cripple Jerry that nobody was to hunt Eli down to kill him, but that if an NF member should run into him, Eli should be killed. On the night of Eli's murder, Dump Truck received a phone call from Albert Reveles and Timothy Timo Hernandez. Timo told Dump Truck that he was at a home where Eli was and that he was running his mouth about Dump Truck, saying that Dump Truck was to be hit by the NF. Timo asked for instruction, but Dump Truck told him he didn't have the authority to authorize the murder because he wasn't in charge. The Dump Truck then contacted Cripple Jerry on a three-way conference call and advised him of the situation. Cripple Jerry then authorized the murder and told Dump Truck, "Do what you gotta do." Hours later, Timo called Dump Truck to report that Eli had been killed. The next target on the hit list was an individual by the name of Esteban Guzman, who was suspected of being a member of a rival gang. In July of 1991, NF member Herminio Spanquillo Serna called Cripple Jerry and told him he was bringing some drugs by for him to sell. When Spanquillo arrived, he told Cripple Jerry that the drugs belonged to a border brother that he had just robbed. Spanquillo said that he shot the paisa with the shotgun and left no witnesses. The victim turned out to be Esteban Guzman. This was a murder Spanquillo committed entirely on his own accord. He made a judgment call to take this guy out so that he could take his drugs, and it was as simple as that. The next victim to be murdered was an individual by the name of Marcos Puppet Baca. Puppet was hit because he was suspected of being an informant. In August of 1991, Spanquillo reported to Cripple Jerry that he killed Puppet with a .22 caliber revolver because he heard Puppet was no good and that he was giving people up in the county jail. The next murder that took place was Bobby Silencio Lopez's girlfriend, Shiela Apodaca. On December 30th, 1990, Lucky met up with Shiela. She would occasionally give Lucky a ride, and Lucky would meet with her prior to her visits with Silencio, who at that time was housed in the Santa Clara County Jail. The day before she was scheduled to visit Silencio, Lucky would meet with her to pass on NF business. She would also meet with Lucky after she visited with Silencio, as he would have messages going back out to Lucky as well. Following one of these meetups, Shiela gave Lucky a ride. During the ride, Shiela brought up the subject of Little Weasel's murder. Shiela said she believed Lucky and the others were crazy, basically telling Lucky that she thought they were crazy for taking out Little Weasel. Lucky told Silencio about this conversation with Shiela, but Silencio told Lucky not to worry because Shiela didn't know what was going on. That didn't make any sense. She obviously knew something was going on. On August 26, 1991, at an NF meeting at Carlos Guzman's apartment, Sheila's murder, as well as the murder of Ray Chocolate Perez's murder, was also discussed. Lucky explained that he, Spanquillo, and Cripple Jerry all wanted to kill Shiela and Chocolate. The next day, Lucky and Carlos were arrested. From the county jail, Lucky sent Silencio a message saying that the Chocolate and Shiela murders were still on. Cripple Jerry would later say that Shiela was to be killed because Silencio had learned that Shiela was going to tell the police about Silencio's involvement in the Little Weasel murder. Silencio called Shiela a snitch bitch. On one hand, Silencio followed NF law when it comes to someone providing this kind of damaging information. But what you don't hear about is how Shiela came to find out about the details of this murder. It's called pillow talk. Pillow talk is when an NF member exposes his involvement in his crimes to his wife or lady, most often for the purpose of impressing her. Shiela shouldn't have known about the details of that murder in the first place. She wasn't there when it was committed. She was told about these details later. Subsequently, Cripple Jerry arranged a meeting with Shiela at Mount Pleasant High School. The purpose of the meeting was obviously to lure her to her death. Cripple Jerry then called Spanquillo and Wevel and told them to proceed to the meeting place. When Spanquillo and Wevel went to the appointed place, Cripple Jerry stayed behind, nervous from knowing that he had set up Shiela to be murdered. When Spanquillo and Wevel returned, Spanquillo told Cripple Jerry that he had shot Shiela twice in the head with a .357 caliber revolver. Before the murder even took place, Silencio was heard talking on the phone, telling people to watch the evening news to see the details of the Shiela murder. And even though you guys probably haven't heard this too often, NF leadership didn't like the fact that Silencio was boasting and bragging about the murder before it had even taken place. That's not the level of professionalism an NF member is expected to exhibit. The last murder to take place was NR member Ray Chocolate Perez. Chocolate was accused of talking to the police, losing regiment drugs, and disrespect. Among other things, Chocolate was also suspected of having an affair with Silencio's girl Shiela. Coincidentally, Chocolate was the one who sponsored me into the NR back in 1989 when we were in San Quentin's reception center, West Block. Small world, everything comes full circle sooner or later. So Silencio told Lucky that Chocolate was giving him a hard time, that he was being irresponsible and was losing drugs. Silencio wrote Lucky and said he wanted to kill Chocolate, but Lucky told him to wait. My guess is that Silencio was motivated by the fact that Chocolate was supposedly having an affair with his girl Shiela. Whatever the case, Chocolate's murder was kicked around at the same NF meeting in which Sheila's murder was discussed. On August 29, 1991, Cripple Jerry met with Huevo and Gusano. Cripple Jerry volunteered to lure Chocolate to a meeting and to also accompany Huevo and Gusano to that meeting. When they arrived at the meeting place, Chocolate came up to the window of the car and spoke with them. When Chocolate got in the car, the four of them mobbed off. When the car stopped, Cripple Jerry and Gusano both shot Chocolate. This was Cripple Jerry's actual first murder for the NF. After almost a year and 10 bodies later, San Jose authorities had seen enough. Most of the perpetrators that were involved were picked up and arrested on either weapons charges or parole violations. That gave authorities the time they needed to put the cases together, to convene the grand jury proceedings, and to get all their ducks in order. After convening a grand jury and calling in Dump Truck to testify against the gang as a star witness, prosecutors were able to indict 21 members and associates of the gang. Once they had all the players in custody, then it was just about connecting all the dots and waiting to see who was going to tap out and attempt to save themselves, who was going to catch that first bus, and whose loyalty was going to waver. This is typical in big gang cases. I've told you guys this before. It always happens. You indict 2 or 3 dozen, and then they either begin weeding themselves out, or the ones who decide that this isn't the type of lifestyle that they want to live decide to work with the prosecution and cut deals for themselves. Aside from the actual regimental members that were arrested on the streets, prosecutors were able to indict 2 of the organization's top generals, Vincent Chente Arroyo and Joseph Pinky Hernandez, who were both housed in Pelican Bay's SHU program. They were accused of killing Tony Little Weasel Herrera, Larry Valles, and Esteban Guzman, alleged drug dealers who reportedly balked at paying taxes to the NF. Eli Rosas was said to have disrespected other gang members. Marcos Puppet Baca, thought to be a snitch, was found shot to death on the grounds of Santee Elementary School. Ray Chocolate Perez, who may have made the mistake of breaking gang rules, was also said to be indulging in heroin and was suspected of having an affair with an NF member's girlfriend, Shiela Apodaca. The 7th victim to die, Shiela Apodaca, was allegedly killed on the orders of her boyfriend, Silencio, with Lucky weighing in, because she furiously objected to his womanizing and threatened to retaliate. According to prosecutors, the order to kill Shiela was placed by phone from the 4th floor of the Santa Clara County Jail. This was where Silencio was being held at that time on other charges. Despite the fact that they were facing at least life behind bars, these guys seemed to bask in the perverse prestige of their dangerous gangster roles. Everything about the trial had to be done specially, from the remodeled courtroom with the special glassed-in platform for the 2 defendants, to the police snipers on the courthouse roof, to the made-to-order cells in the county jail security housing unit. Spanquillo resembled nothing so much as a wide-eyed college student, and Huevo could have been a portly businessman, except for the metal anklet above his thick loafers. Pájaro, with his facial tattoos and street-tough expression, for a while wore his jumpsuit to trial, but then he softened his approach with preppy turtleneck shirts and slacks. With his androgynous good looks and slender physique, Silencio hardly looks the lethal Romeo who prosecutors say ordered his lover shot, gunned down 2 men, and after being mistakenly released from San Quentin, was arrested after a high-speed chase that forced another car off of a Fresno overpass. The families of the victims were noticeably absent from the courtroom. Some of the victims had someone close or familiar to them that had destroyed their family ties through drug use and criminal activity. Some, like Shiela Apodaca's family, lived too far away to follow the case. They assumed it had been resolved years before it actually was. A pretty girl with lustrous brown hair, Shiela Apodaca had lived all her life in the tiny Central Valley town of San Lorenzo before she hooked up with Silencio and moved to San Jose. Silencio had arrived in San Lorenzo as a teenager and quickly made a reputation as a heartless tough guy. Sheila's family disapproved of the match and was relieved when she called home to say she was coming back. They weren't feeling Silencio at all, and the family had a bad feeling about the prospect of Sheila's future as long as she was with them. The next thing her family knew, she was dead, shot execution style in the back of the head on a San Jose street. She was 21 when she died. She had barely begun to experience life as she knew it. The indictments against the Nuestra Familia, released in 1992, charged 21 defendants with plotting and committing 6 murders. 13 of the defendants faced the death penalty. The first arrests were followed by even more killings, as hits were allegedly ordered by leaders in jail, and the members who remained on the street battled for position. Not long after this indictment was unsealed, Eddie Little Rocha Roche and William Dreamer Fernandez from the San Francisco Mission were arrested and indicted for killing Federico Arevalo and Barry San Jose, who were also from the city. The theme continued. These were all my homeboys, and I grew up with all of them, but politics got a hold of them, and the rest was history. Federico was moving a lot of weight in the mission, and like Larry Valles, he just wasn't one to be pressed and made to feel like he was being taxed. The thing that was different about this situation is that Federico was a fully functioning NR member. From what I was able to gather, it was Little Roach's and Dreamer's approach that didn't sit right with Federico. He felt like he was being punked and taxed. Unfortunately for Barry San Jose, he ended up being collateral damage. His mistake was giving Federico a ride to San Jose, where everything happened. He wasn't aware of the political power keg that he was literally driving into, and as a result, it cost him his life. Federico was also tied into the Blancos, and that's where he was getting his PCP from. However, when it came to the politics, that's where John Blanco stepped back and uninvolved himself. Another individual who was involved with luring Federico out there was a guy named Gilbert "Gibby" Garcia from San Jose. Gibby would later end up testifying in that case to cut himself a deal. Not long after this, Little Roach's older brother, Louis "Big Rocha" Roche, ended up getting charged in one of the other indictments. Soon after the trial started, several high-ranking NF and NR members ended up cooperating and turned state's evidence. Lucky and Cripple Jerry both decided to cooperate to avoid the death penalty. Lucky's testimony was pivotal and became critical against some of the other defendants in the case. Soon after Lucky and Cripple Jerry agreed to cooperate, NF General Vincent Chente Arroyo also agreed to cooperate. This was a jaw-dropper that nobody expected, but then again, it just goes to show that everybody, even the guys at the top of the apex, have a breaking point, and that nobody's beyond tapping out. Letters between these guys, dozens of them, while they were fighting these indictments, were cornerstones of the prosecution's case. Thanks to frequent stretches in custody and occasional 10,000-word essays assigned by gang leaders, the art of the handwritten letter flourishes in Nuestra Familia. Penned in Spanish-English patois and carefully worded, the letters reflect the cat-and-mouse game between the inmates and the correctional landlord, who photocopies incoming and outgoing mail. In the letters, the writers often assume women's names, substituting Rhonda for Ron, for instance. It's also common to assume the names of a mother-in-law or the mother of a significant other. Loyalty between fellow members is expressed by phrases such as "yes love" and "I loves you too much." The pages are decorated with tiny whimsical happy faces, but the prosecutors say the coded messages were far from playful, serving to order hits and announce the results. 1 week after Little Weasel was killed, Silencio penned a coded letter to leadership at Pelican Bay State Prison in which every fourth word after punctuation relayed the message. The message, according to this code, was, "Little Weasel is peddling daisies." After receiving a letter warning him that Shiela Apodaca was involving him in the homicides of 2 well-known vatos and needed to be put in check, Silencio replied, "In your most recent response to your most welcomed and vital message, I was already aware of the situation, but didn't figure on the cancer spreading out so wide. However, gracias, and again, just maybe in the near future, we can show you our appreciation in some form or fashion." Among the questionable witnesses cited by the defense was Cripple Jerry by his former brothers. Cripple Jerry, who has traveled in a wheelchair since a car accident over 30 years ago, now prefers a new moniker, Hot Wheels. Cripple Jerry, a Nuestra Raza member who had admitted to setting up Shiela Apodaca and gunning down Ray Chocolate Perez, was a passenger in Silencio's car during the high-speed chase in Fresno. With a plea bargain sentence of 25 to life, Crippled Jerry expected to die in prison. Paraplegics have a shorter than average lifespan, and a gang informant paraplegic in state prison faces even greater risk. But he was determined to repudiate the gang. At one point, I really did believe in the Nuestra Raza and the Nuestra Familia, Crippled Jerry said. We were outnumbered and we needed unity, but we didn't go out and kill our enemies, we went out and killed ourselves. I realized that at some point after Shiela got killed, Crippled Jerry said. But Crippled Jerry defied the odds and finally made it back out of prison a few years ago. Some of you may remember him as we did a short podcast on my channel together. As is often the case with many others who make it back from a life-changing experience like that, Crippled Jerry, or Hot Wheels as he now prefers, has moved on in life and has never looked back. Silencio did love her, Crippled Jerry said, but as it says in the Constitution, you gotta put the NF first, and so he called the hit, you gotta do it. Yet, even ex-gangsters like Crippled Jerry have trouble explaining their devotion to the Nuestra Familia. There is a philosophical component to the Nuestra Familia. It's something like the Mafia meets the Branch Davidians. They like to talk about the struggle or the cause, but who are they really killing? Other Hispanics. The Nuestra Familia is one of a constellation of race-based prison gangs that organize and direct the growing subculture of California's inmates. As the prison population has exploded in the past few decades, so has the influence of gangs. The Mexican Mafia is undisputedly one of the gangs at the top of the roster, with the most members, affiliates, and turf in California. Nuestra Familia, which claims San Jose as one of its turfs, is also at the top of the roster, with a massive amount of influence. State prison experts also include the Aryan Brotherhood to be on the top of the list of current prison gangs in California. When compared with the enormous growth of California's prison industry, the effect on NF trials like this one in San Jose and a federal prosecution of the Mexican Mafia are hard to measure. Big prosecutions are often followed by a flurry of gang activity as the second stringers compete for the vacant positions. But on a more fundamental level, the NF and MA are dying because today's gangsters are of poorer quality than in the past. In the 60s and 70s, the gang leaders had been in the military and had some discipline. They had some very good and strong leadership and bright line rules that you didn't cross. No heroin, for instance, because it makes you untrustworthy, lazy, and without ambition. They were not the kind of guys who would have killed Shiela Apodaca. After 21 defendants, 9 of which were facing the death penalty, only 3 NF members were sentenced to death. All the other defendants either pled out, cooperated, or got life sentences. Silencio, Huevo, and Spanquillo were all sentenced to death and sent to San Quentin State Prison. For their sacrifices, the NF has basically abandoned them and left them to fend for themselves. In the late 90s, they requested that they be given authorization to be given a street regiment so that they could generate money and help themselves, but this request was denied. I personally made this request for them several times, but every time I made it, I was shut down. Maybe it had something to do with Silencio's bragging and boasting. All the letters he continued to write, announcing the results of the victims, despite the fact that everyone was hot at that time. Either way, they made the ultimate sacrifice, a sacrifice of the highest order, giving their lives while pushing the organization's direction forward, only to be forgotten about and pushed aside. When you're no longer in a position to be productive, you become a liability, just another hungry mouth to feed. Silencio continues to be of strong, sound mind, while Huevo was said to have slightly fallen a little bit off the deep end. Currently, Silencio is housed in Salinas Valley State Prison on a main line that was originally part of a pilot program. He was one of the first ones on death row to be sent out, but Huevo will soon follow any time now as San Quentin is no longer equipped to house death row inmates. As for Spanquillo, he was found unresponsive in his cell as a result of an overdose on heroin. Being that Spanquillo was never into drugs, by all accounts, it's believed that he purposely filled up a syringe with black tar heroin, asked his maker for forgiveness, and took his own life. I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. These last few weeks have been nothing short of chaotic, but like they say, when it rains, it pours. Like every other time that I've either lost a loved one or had to deal with some type of setback, I'll get through it. More stories are forthcoming. If you guys like this story, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like this story, give it a thumbs down. But either way, drop a comment and let me know what you think. As always, I want to thank you guys for tapping in and for continuing to support the channel. With that being said, you guys enjoy your weekend and keep pushing that positivity. This your boy B, and I'm out.